Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating look at the modern U.S. China relationship. We're going to be guided by a brilliant recent newsletter from an author we'll affectionately call Papa. Papa offers this incredibly grounded, generational perspective, a worldview that's been deeply shaped by the wisdom of his father, Papa Q Bear, and those long, thoughtful fireside chats with his spouse, Colonel Debs. And really, Papa's whole guiding philosophy boils down to one incredibly powerful question. Is our modern geopolitical landscape defined by historical destiny or by human choice? So let's get into it. Right, so it's the absolute biggest question hanging over almost every single discussion about global politics today. Are the United States and China actually destined for war? We constantly hear this narrative, don't we? This idea of an inevitable, unstoppable clash between a reigning superpower and a rapidly rising one. And this anxiety, it completely shapes our mental model of the future, influencing everything from global markets to massive military budgets. But we really have to ask, is this narrative actually true? To understand where this fear comes from, we've got to look at the theory driving it. The root of all this anxiety is usually tied to something called the Thucydides Trap. It's named after the ancient Greek historian who chronicled the Peloponnesian War, and it describes a pretty deadly pattern. Basically, the rapid rise of Athens instilled such paralyzing fear in the established power, Sparta, that war just became inevitable. Modern political scientists love to point out that over the last 500 years, when a rising power challenges a ruling one, well, it usually ends in total disaster. But here's the catch. Applying a 2,400-year-old template to today's world, we might actually be missing the bigger picture. Act 1. The context. Let's look at the history. So Papa's guiding philosophy is that history should be a compass, not a straitjacket. Cautionary tales are there to warn us, not lock us into some predetermined fate. When we trace the timeline from Athens and Sparta way back in 431 BC, right through the World Wars and into the Cold War, we definitely see a pattern of conflict. But the real pivot point for our modern story happens in 1992. That's when, under Deng Xiaoping, China kicked off this massive manufacturing boom. They became the world's factory and essentially set the stage for the rivalry we're seeing today. Act 2. The tension. Let's dig into the actual data. When we objectively look at the modern data, we start to see some serious fragility beneath the immense scale of these superpowers. Because as it turns out, scale doesn't always equal invulnerability. The U.S. China dynamic actually shatters that ancient Greek mold. Think about it. In antiquity, Athens was the rising maritime democracy, while Sparta was the established land-based oligarchy. Today, those roles are completely scrambled. The U.S. is the established power, sure, but it's a massive democracy that's actually ascending in crucial areas like energy. Meanwhile, China is the rising authoritarian power, but it's heavily land-based and facing some severe existential resource crises. And speaking of resources, the ultimate strategic vulnerability is resource independence. By 2025, the U.S. set a brand new crude oil production record at 13.6 million barrels per day. That cements the U.S. as an absolute energy powerhouse. China, on the flip side, relies on imports for 70% of its oil. 70%. That is a massive hidden vulnerability. Energy security gives Washington strategic options that Beijing just literally doesn't have. You simply cannot fuel a global empire if your energy supply lines are controlled by somebody else. Then we have the demographic ticking clock. China's estimated fertility rate sits at a staggering 1.0, compared to roughly 1.7 in the United States. And why does this matter so much? Because demographics are economic destiny. China's working-age population is actively shrinking, right as its elderly population is growing. It is incredibly difficult to sustain rapid economic expansion, support a massive pension system, and project global power when the very labor force beneath you is contracting. Now you might be wondering, what do Chinese scholars actually think about all this? We constantly hear the narrative here that America is in an irreversible decline. And yes, some Chinese commentators do talk about the U.S. experiencing what they call hegemonic menopause, basically a state of anxiety and oversensitivity. But objectively speaking, there's a really robust internal debate happening in China. Just look at this quote from a Chinese academic. Many authoritative voices in Beijing fully acknowledge that U.S. structural power is highly resilient and that the status of a strong West is going to remain unchanged for a very long time. They are acutely aware of American strength. Act 3. The connection. How this impacts the globe. So how do these shifting tectonic plates of global power actually affect us? Well, it translates into a rising tide of complexity in our everyday lives. Back in the early 2000s, China dominated labor-intensive exports. Think clothes, toys, everyday items. By the 2010s, a huge educational upgrade pushed them into advanced tech manufacturing. Today, driven by rising Chinese wages and U.S. trade tariffs, the whole system has adapted. When you buy a basic appliance today, it's increasingly likely to be assembled in Vietnam or Bangladesh, even if the underlying parts started out in China. The global supply chain isn't breaking, it's just bypassing the old models. Okay, we absolutely have to address the elephant in the room, the Armageddon factor. This right here is the ultimate reason why the Athens and Sparta comparison is deeply flawed. The US has around 6,000 nuclear weapons. China has an estimated 700. This fundamentally changes the entire calculus of war. Nuclear deterrence ensures that both nations have massive existential incentives to compete intensely on economics, on tech, on influence, but to stop short of direct catastrophic military conflict. There is literally no historical precedent for two powers with this level of destructive capability going to total war.
The synthesis. Let's bring it all together. We've covered ancient history, modern data, and global supply chains. So what are the big takeaways from our fireside chat today? First off, war is absolutely not mechanically inevitable. Second, U.S. structural power, we're talking energy, agriculture, tech, remains overwhelmingly dominant, while China's rise is seriously offset by deep internal demographic and debt challenges. Furthermore, global supply chains are proving to be highly resilient. They're adapting rather than collapsing. And finally, modern deterrence maintains a balance that, yeah, it's fragile, but it's very real.
Which leaves us with this final, Papa-inspired thought. The Thucydides Trap is a mirror reflecting our anxieties. It's not a cage locking us into a fate. Both of these nations face incredible internal challenges. If history is shaped by choice rather than destiny, the question isn't whether we are fated to fight. The real question is whether we have the human wisdom to manage our rivalries and ensure our future outlasts our ancient fears. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this journey gives you a clearer, more focused understanding of the world today.